know that well, first of all, I'm Erin Bates. I'm with DOH Pinellas, and I'm the preparedness planner. So, um, even though, yes, hurricanes are a pretty routine part of that job, we've also, over the past several years in particular, paid a lot more closer attention to heat-related illness, kind of monitoring reports of it, and trying to provide some more education about it. I think all of us living in Florida just sort of take heat as, well, that's just the way that it is. But of course, we've also seen increased averages. I think I'm in Orlando right now, and I think it's every day it's been 6 degrees above the average temperature or average high temperature. And much like we've seen with tropical storm activity, I think we can probably anticipate that some of those averages are going to be inching up higher and higher as time goes on. I think we're seeing a lot more extended high extreme heat situations. And there's obviously, I think all of us who have had the experience, especially if you've ever stood in a long line at Disney World or gone and mowed the lawn or something, or even just walking around or playing outside with kids, you know what that feeling is of, okay, I'm really hot, my face is red, I'm sweating, and I just feel sort of drained. Or you go home at the end of the day after doing a lot of work outside, and you can tell you just don't quite feel right. And usually when that happens to us, just drinking fluids is helpful. Maybe sit down and rest, take a cool shower, that kind of thing. But obviously it can progress to something that can be potentially dangerous, even fatal. This is especially true for people who might not be accustomed to it. Often when we see heat related illnesses that raise the level of needing medical intervention, it's from people who are here from out of town, and they're just not as acclimated to the climate that we have here. They may not realize, oh, I really need to be drinking fluids consistently. I really need to try to get out of the sun and take breaks and so forth. I grew up in the Midwest, and it gets hot there. It gets very hot, but it's a very different heat down here. And oftentimes people who aren't accustomed to it aren't quite sure just how prepared they need to be for it. That being said, it's still relevant to those of us who live here, because we can occasionally get a little bit overly confident about our ability to handle it. I think that you see a lot of people, especially people out doing yard work or something, and it's, well, I've lived here all my life. I'm used to it. I'll recognize when it's getting too hot for me to safely do this. And that is not always the case. We can overestimate our ability to withstand it. So this shows you some of the differences. There's heat exhaustion, which is relatively common. You see that happen a lot. Actually, one of the biggest populations you see it in is in teenage athletes, because they're pushing it really hard outside. I know there's a lot of high school football teams that do practices twice a day, and not surprisingly, that can have a detrimental effect on people, even if they are doing a decent job of staying hydrated and so forth. The worst outcome, obviously, is heat stroke. And heat stroke can be fatal. It's hard to judge how many victims it has each year, because oftentimes heat stroke leads to shutdown of essential organs and functions of your body. So the direct cause of death might be that your kidneys failed and then the rest of your organs failed. But the original issue was that you got overheated, and that caused you to maybe have a seizure or have lose consciousness and have other issues. So that's obviously much more serious. That tends to happen just like heat exhaustion. Some of the vulnerable populations are about what you would think. It's infants, elderly people, basically people who can't regulate their internal body temperature, as well as a healthy 30-year-old might be able to. But Also, men are more likely to suffer from it, and people who live with mental illness are more likely, in part because they may not necessarily recognize that they have symptoms from it and that they require medical intervention. So this is kind of the simplified area of this is the stuff you need to do right away. Doing some of these things may help you avoid having heat stroke, but a lot of it is pretty common sense type of stuff. You know, drink water. If you're feeling dizzy, thirsty, if you're sweating excessively, but especially if you start to feel nauseated and like you might pass out, you want to try to do these interventions as soon as possible. And if it progresses even after you've tried to do them, then you absolutely need to get medical help. These are a few different resources. The first one I wish was still being updated. It's no longer being updated, but there is still a lot of useful information on there. You know, obviously there are a lot of reporting systems throughout the country that have capture different information from hospitals and emergency departments and so forth. And once they've had a chance to go through that, you can sort of see on a heat map, no pun intended, where some of the highest reports are. It's not a huge surprise because you get Arizona, for example, has pretty significant rates of heat illness. Florida, we certainly have ours, but there's also historic events that show that you don't have to live in a state like Florida or Arizona to have serious effects from this. I remember the 1995 heat wave in Chicago that killed hundreds of people. And that was even harder for them because they didn't necessarily have the infrastructure like cooling centers or regulations about not disconnecting people's electricity for unpaid bills. Since that ended up being a huge factor in why there were so many fatalities, and just the attitude of, well, it's the Midwest and it never really gets that hot here that that's what happened, which is kind of similar to what we think of being here in Florida. There's also good information on hydration and just how much you need to be drinking to replace all those fluids and to keep your electrolytes higher. That's especially important because people tend to get to the point where all of a sudden they're like, oh, I'm really thirsty, and they will chug a ton of water, but really you need to just be consistently consuming it. Just, you know, it doesn't even have to be a reusable water bottle. It can be just a plastic one that you can refill at a drinking fountain, and just keep that going so that you are continuously getting those fluids into your body and you're not just sweating them out. At the same time, you also have to be careful to not overdo the consumption. It's a little bit challenging. It is possible to drink too much water, despite what you may have heard. That is something that can happen. And there is also, not surprisingly, a substantial risk for people who are experiencing homelessness. That there are fewer resources available, there are fewer places to go that may provide air conditioning or shelter from sun, and it may be harder to access water. So it's particularly important to make sure that we take advantage of those opportunities to provide those resources for our more vulnerable populations. And this gives you a good sense of the water intake. And I'm one of those people who drinks the water because I'm supposed to, and it's often a bit begrudgingly, but if you get me outside on a hot day, then I will gladly consume as much water as I can possibly get. The only key is you don't want to drink more than about 48 ounces, which I don't think I would be capable of doing, but it's good to remember that you want to keep it consistent and pace yourself. You don't need to be chugging huge amounts at once. It just needs to be consistent so that you're getting ahead of your body, reaching the point where you're hitting hydration or dehydration and putting your health at risk. So that's very good to keep in mind. Does anybody have any questions?
I am not seeing any hands up yet, but I have a question, Erin.
Sure. Yes.
What would you recommend? Because I know, of course, we have some folks on this call who are actively experiencing homelessness. We also have some folks on this call who are supporting folks experiencing homelessness. So, what would you recommend folks supporting our neighbors in need give out? What would you suggest we do or do not distribute to our neighbors experiencing homelessness in this hot weather? I'll point to, for instance, fans. I was told a couple of years ago that fans were not the best thing to distribute. So, any suggestions?
I primarily water first and foremost. That is that everybody needs that on a regular basis, but especially when it's hot outside. I feel like there are times when fans can be useful, but it's sort of like if a hurricane is coming and you're fanning at it, it's not going to have an effect. A fan is great on a day when it's maybe 72 and sunny, but when the feels like temperature is 101, that's just moving around hot air only a little bit. I have found that some of the cooling towels can be helpful. They absorb perspiration, but they're also cool enough you can put it over your head, and that helps keep you cool. Even things like a hat, not just a baseball cap, but like a wide brimmed hat. That's giving you more protection both for your head and your shoulders and gives you a bit of a respite from the direct sun and just providing those places where there's shade, ensuring that if you see somebody who is looking like they've been out in the sun too long and they look like they might be getting dehydrated, intervening if you can. My office is very close to Mirror Lake, and I often walk around the lake and try to bring some bottles of water with me because there have been times where people, you can tell it's a hot day and they're trying to get in the shade, but it's hard to get ahead of it sometimes when the heat's been pretty unrelenting, as we know it can be here in Florida.
Yeah, I've been in Florida for about 30 years now, and I'm still shocked by how hot I am every
Of
year. So that is wonderful information. Thank you so much
course,
for jumping on, especially while you're in Orlando. Thank you for joining us, Erin.
that's
I
fine.
really appreciate it. If anybody else has any other questions for Erin, please go ahead, put those in the chat. And I do believe, Erin, correct me if I'm wrong, but you might have to hop off early, but
I do, but
yes,
anybody, you've got my contact
yes.
information. Anybody, feel free to reach out to me. I'm
Perfect. So if you have
around.
questions for Erin, share them, send them our way. We'll make sure that we share them with Miss Bates and we will get them back out to you. And thank you again for joining us.
And I think you have a copy of the presentation. So any of the links and resources on there, feel free to send that out and share it, and people can access the resources.
Perfect. Appreciate you so much. Thank you so
Great.
much, Erin. Have a great rest
Thank
of your
you.
day.
You too.
All right.